One the subtle distance. He was still in the bed, but somehow, he wasn't there anymore. She felt it before she understood it, that quiet shift you can't explain. Nothing dramatic, no fight, no goodbye. Just a presence that slowly turned into silence. Have you ever been that close to someone, and still felt completely alone? Before we go deeper, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast, because some truths aren't loud, they're hidden in moments like this. At first, it was subtle. He still texted good morning, but hours later. Still kissed her, but without that pause that used to mean something. His eyes? They stopped looking into her, and started passing through her. She told herself it was stress, work, life, anything but the truth. Because admitting it meant facing something heavier. He wasn't leaving, but he was already gone. And the scariest part? He stayed just enough to make her doubt what she felt. To the illusion of normal. From the outside, nothing looked broken. That was the cruel part. They still showed up to dinners. Still stood side by side in photos. Still knew exactly when to smile. When to laugh. When to make it all look easy. If someone had asked, she probably would have said they were just tired. Busy. Going through a phase. Because that answer felt safer than the truth. And the truth was harder to hold than silence. He still remembered small things. How she took her coffee. Which side of the bed she liked. What movie she always fell asleep halfway through. He hadn't turned cold in any obvious way. He was still kind, still polite, still there in all the ways people could see. But the version of him that used to reach for her without thinking. The version that noticed her moods before she spoke. The version that made her feel emotionally chosen, that version was fading. So she started performing normal right beside him. She laughed a little louder when they were out with friends. She filled quiet spaces before anyone else could notice them. She became careful with her questions. Careful with her face. Careful with the ache that kept rising every time he gave her a clean, easy answer instead of something real. I'm fine. Just tired. It's nothing. Those words became the walls of the life they were still pretending to share. And what made it worse was how believable it all looked. There were no shattered plates. No slammed doors. No final scene dramatic enough to justify her grief. Just 100 tiny absences hidden inside ordinary days. A hand that no longer lingered. A conversation that never went deeper. A kiss that landed like habit instead of love. That is how confusion begins. Not with chaos, but with consistency. A life that still appears intact while something essential has already gone missing. And because nothing looked wrong enough to name, she kept doubting herself. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe she expected too much. Maybe love was supposed to become quieter than this. But deep down, she knew the difference between peace and emptiness. He was still playing the role. And she was still helping him play it. 3 patterns that don't lie. At some point, it stopped feeling like a phase, and started feeling like a pattern. Not the kind you notice all at once. The kind that builds quietly, repetition by repetition, until one day you realize it's no longer accidental, it's consistent. He didn't ignore her, not exactly. He just responded less. Shorter, safer. Conversations that used to stretch into hours now ended in minutes. Not because there was nothing to say, but because he no longer stayed long enough to say it. He always had a reason. Work ran late, his phone died, he was tired. And none of those things were impossible. That's what made it harder. There was always just enough logic to keep her from calling it what it really was. Avoidance. He stopped asking questions he used to care about. Stopped noticing when her voice changed slightly. Stopped leaning in when something felt off. And the silence between them? It wasn't peaceful anymore. It became a space where things were left unsaid, on purpose. She began to track the shifts without meaning to. How many times he checked his phone while she was talking. How often he changed the subject when things got real. How quickly he turned away, physically, emotionally, whenever closeness asked for more than comfort. These weren't accidents. They were choices, repeated gently enough to look like coincidence. And that's what patterns do. They don't shout, they accumulate. She started asking herself questions she didn't want the answers to. If I disappeared for a day, would he notice the silence? If I stopped reaching out, would he come closer, or just drift further? Because deep down, she already knew something painful. People don't withdraw all at once. They do it in pieces. In habits. In small, almost invisible decisions. And when you line those decisions up, they tell a story no words ever will. For the breaking silence. Eventually, the silence became harder to survive than the truth. It had been building for weeks. Maybe longer, not through screaming or slammed doors, but through the slow ache of things left unfinished. Half answers, hollow routines, nights that looked intimate from the outside but felt unbearably cold from within. She had carried that feeling quietly, hoping it would pass, hoping one honest moment from him would return them to something real. But hope can become its own kind of exhaustion when it has nothing solid to hold. So one night, she stopped pretending not to notice. There was nothing dramatic about the room. No rain against the windows. No music in the background. Just the soft hum of ordinary life. Which somehow made it worse. He was right there beside her. Close enough to touch. Close enough to call it together. And yet she had never felt farther from him. She asked the question gently at first. Not to accuse him. Not to start a fight. Just to hear something true. Are you still here with me? The words hung between them longer than they should have. He didn't answer right away. Didn't turn toward her. Didn't reach for her hand. And in that pause, she felt something inside her begin to break, not because he had said something cruel, but because silence was becoming the answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, careful, almost too careful. I don't know. That was it. No explosion. No confession big enough to match the pain. Just 4 words that made every small doubt suddenly line up into one unbearable truth. She didn't cry immediately. That came later. In the bathroom. In the car. In the strange private places where people go to fall apart without being seen. In that moment, she just sat there, staring at the person she loved, realizing she had been trying to save something he had already stopped protecting. And maybe that was the deepest wound of all. Not that he no longer knew how to love her the way she needed, but that some part of him had known for a while, and let her keep reaching anyway. There is a special kind of heartbreak in that. When the relationship doesn't shatter all at once. It simply tells the truth out loud for the first time. And once that truth is spoken, even softly, nothing goes back to the way it was. 5. The core wound. After that night, the question wasn't what happened to them. It became something quieter, and far more personal. Why did she stay, even when she could feel him slipping away? The answer didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, in the spaces where she finally stopped blaming the timing, the stress, the phase. Because at some point, it stopped being about him, and started pointing back to something deeper inside her. It wasn't just love that kept her there. It was fear. Not the loud kind, not panic. But a quiet, familiar fear she had carried long before him. The fear of being left, and the even deeper fear of being too much for someone to stay. So she adjusted. She made herself easier to love. Less emotional, less demanding, less visible. She learned how to read the room before speaking. How to swallow questions before they turned into conflict. How to accept, almost, as if it were enough. because losing him completely felt heavier than slowly losing herself. And he, whether he understood it fully or not, leaned into that space. He didn't need to disappear dramatically. He just had to pull back slightly, and she would step forward to close the distance. Again, and again, and again. That's how the dynamic formed. One person quietly withdrawing, the other quietly chasing. Not out of weakness, but out of wounds that had never been named. His distance wasn't just indifference. It was avoidance, a discomfort with emotional depth he didn't know how to hold. And her persistence wasn't just love. It was an attempt to finally feel chosen in a way she hadn't before. Two patterns, perfectly misaligned. And that's what made it so painful. Because neither of them were trying to hurt each other. They were just protecting themselves, in ways that slowly broke the connection between them. This is what people often miss. The deepest heartbreak doesn't always come from betrayal or sudden loss. Sometimes, it comes from two people meeting at the exact wrong place in their emotional lives. Where one is afraid to come closer, and the other is afraid to let go. And somewhere in between those two fears, love gets stretched, thinner and thinner, until there's almost nothing left to hold. 6. The mirror moment. That was the moment it stopped being only about them. Because once the silence had been named, once the pattern had been seen, she could no longer hide inside the idea that this was just one broken relationship. One difficult season. One man who didn't know how to stay emotionally present. The pain began to shift. It stopped pointing only at him, and started reflecting something back at her. Not blame. Not shame. Recognition. She started noticing how familiar this feeling really was. The waiting, the overreading, the instinct to shrink herself just enough to keep someone comfortable. The way she could sense distance before a word was spoken, and still choose hope over clarity. It wasn't new. That was the part that shook her. This relationship hadn't created the wound. It had revealed it. And that realization can feel almost cruel at first. Because it means the heartbreak is not only about losing someone else. It's about meeting the version of yourself who has been surviving on emotional crumbs for much longer than you wanted to admit. The version that learned to call inconsistency mixed signals. The version that called silence patience. The version that kept translating absence into something softer, something less threatening, because the truth felt too sharp to hold directly. She saw it clearly now. She had not only been asking him to choose her. She had been asking his love to repair an older ache. To prove that if she stayed gentle enough, useful enough, understanding enough, someone would finally stop leaving. Someone would finally turn toward her without hesitation. Someone would finally say, with their actions, not just their words, "You don't have to earn being loved." But that is the danger of unhealed wounds. They do not just hurt. They recruit. They pull you toward people who feel familiar, even when familiar is painful. They convince you that longing is depth, that confusion is chemistry, that being almost chosen is still a form of intimacy. And for a while, you believe it, because it matches something unfinished inside you. That was her mirror moment. Not the moment she saw him clearly. The moment she saw herself clearly. How much she had normalized loneliness. How quickly she mistook survival for love. How often she abandoned her own truth before anyone else had the chance to abandon her. And once you see that, really see it, you cannot go fully back to sleep inside the old story. 7. The quiet ending. They didn't end with a slammed door, a dramatic goodbye, or some final sentence that made everything clear. That was the hardest part. Nothing truly shattered. It just thinned out. The calls became shorter. The pauses became longer. The love didn't explode. It faded, quietly, Until one day she realized she was grieving something that had disappeared long before it was ever named. And maybe that's what hurts most about emotional distance. Not that someone leaves all at once, but that they leave in pieces, while still standing next to you. Some endings don't come with closure. They come with silence, with questions that never get answered, with a last look that doesn't feel final until much later. If this story felt familiar, maybe it's because some heartbreaks don't scream, they whisper. Share this with someone who might need it. Tell me in the comments what line stayed with you. Like this video if it touched something real in you. And subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories that say the quiet parts out loud.